Hello everyone, well welcome to another edition of the Classic Rock and Prog Almanac with myself, Tim Appleton, all on me Todd this week. Now I decided to do a slightly personal episode discussing one of my favourite female artists, Kate Bush. I don't know if you guys are into her, but I certainly am. And I thought I'd discuss Never Forever, which is her third album. It's a pop album, but somewhat proggy in conception and construction, as we will see going through. I love this album. I love Kate Bush in general. Some may remember our top 10 ladies list that we did last year. I had, I think, at number one. This is not actually perhaps my favourite album by her. I mean, I think that would be Lionheart. So you might say, why not do that one instead? But I don't know. Sometimes people seem to prefer this one, so I thought I'd give it a go anyway. Leave Lionheart for another day. For me, it's probably a toss-up in terms of her favourite album between Lionheart and The Dreaming, which is the one after this. So once again, I've taken the middle course for no apparent reason. But I mean, the fact that this lands in the middle of two masterpieces, I think, it speaks to its quality, really. Spectacularly good, this album, all of that notwithstanding. And I should say, really like Hounds of Love, which is the fifth album. After that, Kate Bush and I slightly part company. I don't really know why, but I feel like the albums after that point don't work particularly well. It's difficult to understand why artists kind of lose their their sort of inventiveness, but I don't know, that's just me speaking. But anyway, as I say, the run of albums from Lionheart to Hounds of Love, I think, is really unmatched. The first album's got one or two lovely tunes on it, I think, but to me it doesn't match up to the subsequent four albums, which I think basically are all masterpieces. She's starting to use synths and early samplers, I think, a lot on this third album, Never Forever. The synths really come into their own on the follow-up, The Dreaming, which is a famously sort of space age album. But yeah, it's even on this third album, it's starting to get more expansive. Her studio experimentation and the use of synthesizers and so forth. What else? Well, brilliant songs here. I mean, brilliant songs. With a level of musical sophistication that's unusual in pop music, to be honest. And also, by the way, absolutely brilliant lyrics. I mean, she's just so clever, I think. She's such a clever pop artist, as it were. She seems to be able to do anything she wants at this point, and it all works, and she makes it all look really effortless. I sometimes think she's slightly underrated, actually. Now we come to mention it, but anyway, maybe that's just that's I'm just imagining that. I love the programming too, particularly on this album in particular. I'm an album orientated person. I think that's fairly clear from the previous output on this podcast. And the programming on this album, Never Forever, works really well. You start and end with big hit singles, one at the beginning, Babooshka, and two at the end, Army, Dreamers, and Breathing. And then you have a chain of songs in the middle that run perfectly and sort of lead you from one point to the other. So that's great. I think it's a real treat for album fans, this one. A bit like a concept album, like you're going on a journey, really. I mean, maybe it is a concept album. It's not 100% clear. But we're, as I say, I'll sort of come back to that later on, some of these issues. I think we should do an episode on concept albums that aren't really concept albums. That might be another idea for a crapper episode, as it were. Let me give you some Empirifacts, why not? As I said, third studio album, this, by Kate Bush. It was recorded from September 79 to May 1980. And released September 1980. Bit of a long gap, that, isn't it? Don't really know why. It sat in the marketing department, I guess, for 5 months or whatever. It was recorded in Abbey Road and Air Studios in London. You may know those studios from a band called the Beatles, and she's very much in the thick of it. I think Kate Bush, in the thick of the British rock and pop scene at that time. This album went to #1 in the UK, the first album ever by a British female singer-songwriter to do so, apparently. And it also went to #1 in France. Shout out to our French listeners, for they do exist. As many will know, she wrote all of the songs herself, which is sort of interesting, I think. Her sort of individualistic, near solipsistic approach. You wouldn't get that today with, above all, with female pop artists. They seem to have a team of about 25 people writing the songs. Now, what about the cover? It's fairly well known, I think, that the young Kate Bush was slightly sexualised. I mean, I think it's fair to say that. I don't know how willing a participant she was in all of that. Although she seems to play around with it a bit. And this cover, the cover to this album is no exception. It's an illustration of a random set of monsters. Slightly reminiscent, I think, of the book Where the Wild Things Are, which many will know. It's a children's book, illustrated children's book. And this reminds us, I think, that Kate Bush's fantasy life is sort of foregrounded in the thematisation of her LPs. And this is even underlined by the fact that the monsters are actually emerging from under her dress, right? I.e., we presume her private parts. What's the polite way of saying this? That's the generous interpretation. Imagine that. Anyway, yeah, so it's very childlike, this cover. Sort of quasi-innocent, let's say, in a sort of Lewis Carroll way, kind of proto-Freudian, perhaps. So it's got a slight surreal air, surrealist air, I should say. And I think this sort of bourgeois fantasy life motif is very English. And Kate Bush is a very English artist, really. The album title, which is not referenced in the lyrics, I think, it's supposed to be about sort of weathering good and bad emotions, I believe. I think she said that herself. And that's why there's good and bad monsters on the cover, hidden under her dress, which is very Freudian too, of course, that binarism. Between the sexual and the sexual drives and the death drive, Eros and Thanatos. So I suppose what I'm really saying is that the cover indicates that this is a very Freudian album. It's very dreamy sounding, if that doesn't sound too superficial, and full of references to dreams. And the cover is clearly evoking a dream. So I was thinking perhaps we could say that this is like Kate Bush. This is like a pop star reading the interpretation of dreams by Freud. Maybe this is all part of the concept, non-concept that is this concept, non-concept album. All right, let's go to tracks. Now, side 1 begins with Babooshka, as I already mentioned. Now, what I think, big hit single, this one, of course. What I think is interesting about this track is that it ties in with the whole theme of the album, with its, as I said, the standalone title on the cover. Namely, it's about good and bad, right? And here, the iteration is of the angel and the whore, as it were, Of course, this will remind listeners of Freud's essay on the universal tendency to debasement in the sphere of love, in which he famously concludes that, and I quote him, "Where men love, they do not desire, and where they desire, they cannot love." Right? And of course, Kate Bush gives a fairly concise definition of the Freudian uncanny in the song, because the new lover, because Babooshka, the story is that Babooshka is like a fake persona invented by a wife to seduce her husband, right? And so this new, and he meets her, in private, this other woman, but of course he doesn't realise it's his wife, right? So this new lover, as it were, kind of reminds him of the wife, right? So there's this play between, as I've mentioned before in this podcast, between what you simultaneously know and don't know, i.e. between the conscious and the unconscious agencies, right? So yeah, as I said, this story is about a woman whose husband doesn't love her anymore, so she pretends to be someone else, and writes him letters and meets with him in disguise. Actually, I think that sounds like a very Shakespearean artifice. And Shakespeare, of course, was a writer that Kate Bush was pretty obsessed with. She meets him in disguise in order that he'll fall in love with her again. Now, what's interesting about the story, I think, is that it's not clear whether it's a female fantasy or a male one, right? Which is, curious. It actually made me think a little bit of the David Lynch film Blue Velvet, which I don't know whether people know, but there's quite a nice reading of it by Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, where he talks about the sex scene in Blue Velvet and says that it's not clear whether, because she's having sex with this sort of mafiosi type, Isabella Rossellini, and what's his name, the actor, can't remember his name, the main actor, but he is hiding from them in a cupboard, and Zizek says that this is like he's sort of fantasizing the primal parental sex scene, right? But it's not clear whether it's his fantasy or whether it's actually her fantasy being watched by him having sex with the father. Basically, this is all very Freudian, of course. But yeah, so it's not clear exactly whose fantasies is in play here. That's what I thought. Now, along the same lines, the original implication of the story seems to be that she wants her husband back, but of course she's actually elaborately inducing him to end the relationship, right? So it's all a play of mirrors, this one. Musically, it all fits because the song starts in G sharp minor, but it very quickly goes up to E flat minor. In other words, we've got constant key changes in the track, as if to mirror the shifts of identity. It also shifts, of course, between major and minor keys, specifically E flat major and E flat minor, in order to move between, tragedy and comedy or irony, and finally, what else? This is reflected in the arrangement, I think, which shifts from sort of timid verses to quite strident choruses as the protagonist adopts a new identity in the chorus, Babooshka, right? So, as I say, you can see from all this how unusually literary and intellectual this track is. It's quite unusual for pop music, wouldn't you say? Apparently, I read that the very prominent fretless bass in this track is supposed to represent the mute male character, which is reinforced in the video, I think, in which she seems to be sexing up a double bass, but I can't really speak to that. And of course, Babooshka means grandmother in Russian, so the story seems to evoke the kind of deep emotional well of Russian literature, which I'm sure Kate Bush is also familiar with, as well as making it sound even more incestuous, right? Apparently Kate Bush said she didn't know that Babooshka meant grandmother in Russian, but once again, maybe it was her unconscious speaking. In any case, it's a perfectly brilliant pop song, this. I think pop music doesn't come any better than this. The harmonies are interesting, the melody's really catchy, and the themes are just really dense and interesting, and as I say, very literary. Now, side one, track 2 is Delius, in brackets, Song of Summer. Now, this is sort of a mood piece, although it's fairly harmonically elaborate, I think. The main theme sort of vaguely echoes Erik Satie's first Gymnopédie, which I've talked about before on this podcast, because it's got that D sharp note running through a B to E chord sequence, B major to E major chord sequence. Only vaguely evokes Erik Satie, but it's definitely in the sound there somewhere. And of course, we have another serious music theme in this track because the song's called Delius, and it's about the English orchestral composer Delius. It's actually apparently based on a 1968 Ken Russell film. Anyone remember Ken Russell? Do you remember him? He made Tommy. He's a very famous English director, famous for making very weird films. And the subtitle of the track is Song of Summer, which is a famous orchestral piece by Delius, right? But I don't think, if memory serves, that there's any reference to the piece in this track by Kate Bush. So it mainly seems to be kind of program music here. What's the program then? That's the question. So the story seems to be that Kate Bush is sort of hanging around with Delius in his garden in the summer while he sits paralysed and writes music. I think he was blind, actually, at this point. And it's definitely summer because you can hear bees buzzing around, right, in the background. Delius is a grumpy guy, a grumpy character, presumably partly because he's got syphilis. Another sexual reference there. And her job is to cheer him up, right? A bit like his amanuensis Eric Fenby, right? And once again, of course, there's a Freudian motif here because she seems to portray herself as the sort of seductive granddaughter of the old man in the garden, right? So maybe the primal scene in the end is the English country garden, right? Echoes of Genesis' musical box here for anyone who's a Genesis fan. But I suppose, like, more accurately, she seems to be replacing Fenby in the fantasy. Because, again, we're in the realms of fantasy here, right? So she may be playing a man here, which is yet another sexual reference, because there may be the intimation in the Russell film of a homosexual relation between Fenby and Delius. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm fairly sure that that's the case. At least as a subtext, right? So it's Kate Bush seducing an elderly man as syphilitic elderly man, but in the guise of a man, right? Anyway, whatever. It's delightful, this song. Beautiful little interlude, I think. Perfect contrast to the pop stridency of Babooshka, I would say. Side 1, track 3 is called Blow Away for Bill. It's for Bill is a reference to her one of her crew who died. Because let's start again. This seems to be a song about near-death experiences. And apparently one of her crew died in a freak accident at one of her gigs. And this seems to sort of generate the theme of the song. As I said, hence the subtitle. So it's sort of about a musician having a near-death experience, as far as I can make out, and ending up in a room with loads of dead rock stars. Imagine that. I'll name them: Minnie Riperton, Keith Moon, Sandy Denny, Sid Vicious, Mark Bolan, and Buddy Holly. And it's sort of weird because it's played for comedy, this one. That's to say, when the person gets to the waiting room, could be a reference to purgatory there, of course. This is rather metaphysical, this track. A bit like, sort of, again, Genesis, the waiting room. But when this person sort of has this near-death experience and gets to the waiting room, the people there are so cool that the protagonist doesn't want to go back, to their actual life, right? But they have to. So this is actually, I would say, a repeated theme in Kate Bush's work, the gap between her desire and the reality, which again I think is sort of her hysterical side, because hysteria, the hysterical structure is paradigmatically the female structure, right? It sort of overlays, as I think I said before, a homosexual desire. But anyway, let's not get too deep into that because it's too complicated. But yeah, really, here the hysteria is played out as kind of not wanting to rest or let things go, Now, musically, I think this track follows the aesthetic of the rest of the album quite well. The comedy part is in a major key, and the rest of the songs in the minor. Again, not relative major and minor, but actually just playing the home key in major and minor. So again, it's got that tragicomic vibe, and it's that shifting between two sides of a binarism, which we mentioned before. And the accompaniment, by the way, is full of lots of jazzy minor seventh chords, which is nice. There's a lot of that on this album, sort of jazzy chordage, if that's a word. And then finally, this is the song where you really start to notice how she's using her voice as an instrument, which she does more and more throughout her career. She's trying lots of different types of vocalization. I think this might be a way of trying to escape more traditional melody writing, right? And as I sort of intimated earlier, it gets more fleshed out on the following album. But because I think it's difficult for people to keep constructing hymn-like melodies over and over again without looking for a different approach, right? And that seems to be where she's going with this. It's probably only so many times that you can write and rewrite The Man with the Child in His Eyes. So yeah, very moving, as I say, metaphysical number, this one, elegiac, but kind of light-hearted. Now, side one, track 4 is All We Ever Look For. Now, what this track makes me think of is the incredible sophistication of the harmonic structures that she's using. I'm not sure people are really aware of how difficult it is to do what she's doing. This is why I was saying earlier, I think she's slightly underrated, right? Most pop songs seem to use some variation of those sort of famous doo-wop chords, you know, C, A minor, F, G. But the chord sequences here are all over the bloody place, you know. She goes from E flat major to G sharp minor to E major and then back to E flat, right? And it all feels incredibly natural. And it has a melody that's expertly woven throughout, so it sounds very organic. Even though actually in its sort of construction, it's all very unusual. And this is the real achievement, I think. You know, this is proper composition, I think, you know, with a capital C, as it were. It's not at all mechanical or faked. And I think it comes across intuitively when you hear her, you know, but maybe that's just my impression. Anyway, yeah, it's another beautiful song, this one, All We Ever Look For, I think. Has a sort of slight baroque pop style as well, slightly courtly sounding, maybe Bridgerton vibes, which feels on brand for Kate Bush. Now, I think this is the song really, what are the lyrics about, All We Ever Look For? Well, this is a song about parents. So once again, we're in the realm of the Freudian family romances, as it were. It appears to be about how children fulfill their parents' desires, you know, or otherwise, you know. So I've got a couple of quotes here. She sings, "Leave the breast and then the nest and then regret you ever left," right? So funnily enough, there's an explicit reference to the oral phase there, right? What Freud would call the oral phase, where the whole world of the child is basically the mother's breast. And then she sings, "All we ever look for, a drug. All we ever look for, a great big hug," right? Which is kind of a Freudian joke, you know. We're always sort of looking to go back to the mother's breast, but we know that way lies danger, right? And we're always trapped in that sort of, what's it called? Like tessitura, is that the word? All we ever look for, another womb, another open door. This is what the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan called the dialectic of desire. We desire the other's desire, which is also elusive, always elusive. Right? The other with the capital O here, otherwise known as the mother, right? If you add an M. This issue of maternal identification on the part of the child, and then the adult, of course, is important. Actually, it's going to come back later on this album, but you know, that's a spoiler alert. All right, now number 5, final track on side 1 is Egypt. Now I talked earlier about hysterical desire, and as I said, it's quite well established in psychoanalysis that hysterical desire is fundamentally homosexual, lesbian, essentially. To wit, this song, Egypt. I mean, this is a song about her being in love with Egypt. So I initially thought this was like a sort of tourist board song. But, of course, Egypt, I mean, inevitably is a woman, right? So there's some sort of apparently sapphic desire here. She sings, bear with me, "My pussy queen knows all my secrets. I'll never fall in love again. I drift with dunes. I whisper of the tombs. They offer me Egyptian delights. They've got me with that feline guise, got me in those desert eyes. Oh, I'm in love with Egypt. So the tombs there, a fairly explicit reference to genitalia, I would say, female genitalia. And then you've got follow the Nile, deep to much deeper, she says. And what else? Then the sands run red in the lands of the pharaohs. Their symmetry gets right inside me. So it's like she's having a competition with herself to find the most suggestive euphemism in this track. Now the track has a sort of gypsy-ish harmony. It keeps going from E minor to F at the end of the line, I think. The end of when the line plays itself out. Which I think is supposed to be evocative of the theme, because the word gypsy in English comes from the idea that gypsies come from Egypt, right? Which apparently isn't true. So that's quite a funny example of Orientalism, right? I mean, Kate Bush would probably be anti-Orientalist, I suppose. But on the other hand, she's very English. So Orientalist by birth, I suppose, in a way. So we can't ignore that. Obviously, I'm thinking about the Edward Said book here, Orientalism. He mainly blames the British and the French in that book for inventing the discourse of Orientalism. Anyway, I don't think this is the greatest track on the album. For my money. I mean, it does have one or two nice harmonic developments, I think. Although I find the end of the line to be slightly thrown away, right? Again, we're dealing with minor seventh jazzy chords, right? Which, as I say, is a big feature of her music at this time. Must have been listening to a lot of jazz. It seems possible for her. I mean, slightly sounds like jazz era Joni Mitchell as well in places, I think. Although I might be saying this because they're both women, which is a pretty feeble comparison, isn't it? Anyway, so yeah, as I say, not my favourite track on the album, this one, but it's fine. It's kind of interesting in its way. And let's not get too impatient, because side 2's coming up with a lot of nice treats and surprises. On that subject, side 2, track 1, The Wedding List. Right? Now, this song seems to be based on a Truffaut film, The Bride Wore Black, which I think was sort of an early version of Kill Bill. It's about a woman killing all the men who shot her husband during her wedding ceremony. Right? Hence, the wedding list, right? Which is a nice sort of joke. And it's a joke about a very serious thing. And what's also tragicomic about this track, I think, is that she seems to be more obsessed with getting revenge than anything else, including her wedding itself, right? Which is, I think, is funny. In other words, she's more committed to getting her revenge than she was to getting married to the guy in the first place, right? Was that clear? Sorry, yes. Okay. And she's also more obsessed with getting revenge than the fact that there are mitigating circumstances. I mean, the death seems to have been an accident, at least in the Truffaut film, right? Not in Kill Bill. And most importantly of all, she's more focused on her revenge than the fact that she's actually pregnant, right? Which we find out at the end of the track. In other words, the thing that this woman's in love with more than anything else is her own ego, right? Because that's what's involved in revenge, of course, your ego, right? So, yeah, it's another song about female narcissism and the female psychology, sung by a woman, of course, which is kind of nice. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Quite. It also made me think, this track, of the Euripides play Medea. I don't know whether people know that. Where the female main character is left by her husband for another woman. So she kills their kids to punish him, right? And all of her friends say, no, you can't do that. You're a mother first. And her answer is, no, I'm a wife first. And I've been rejected. So food for thought there. Of course, this is like a psychological mise-en-scène. People should understand I'm not saying any of this literally, and neither was Freud or indeed Euripides, right? Okay. The music on this one is based on on jazzy minor seventh chords. The song's bridge begins with a pause. Then the whole track slows down almost to a stop, and it speeds up again into the chorus, which is an iteration of the verse, really. Now that bridge section also has a sort of stagey quality, slightly cabaret-ish, and I would say Germanic too. So this I think evokes the sort of theatrical threepenny opera style that Kate Bush was clearly influenced by. She already used it on Coffee Home Ground on the previous album, Lionheart, and she actually sang that song in a sort of cod German accent, right? But I think the point here is that the German reference here emphasizes the fact that we're watching a mise en scène being played out, right? You know, we're not supposed to directly identify with the drama. So, you know, if you like, a Verfremdungseffekt, you know. This also diverts our attention back to the psychology of the protagonist, I think. Anyway, it's a very warm, rich, and interesting track, this one, musically, I think. And it's a lot of fun. Funny and fun. Side 2, track 2 is Violin, which is about a violin. Now, it references the famous violinist and composer Paganini, of course. And it also references Old Nick, who's the devil, as I'm sure people know. And so this makes me think that she's really saying that the violin arouses kind of diabolical passions, right? Namely, once again, the demonic death drive. So we're back to Freud again. And musically speaking, I think that Violin is like almost an obligatory punk number, you know, i.e. appropriate to the era. I think she sort of sounds like she's doing an impersonation of one of the famous female punks like Toya Wilcox, now famously married to Robert Fripp, as King Crimson fans will know, or Hazel O'Connor or someone like that. Maybe also Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees. And actually her backing band is singing backing vocals on the track. So she's got a punk band helping her to record this track, which kind of bears out my hypothesis that this is a punk reference, this whole track. You can tell they're singing backing vocals because at one point she sings, give me the Banshees for BVs. It's a bit literalist, that, isn't it? But of course that's the joke. The thing is, I think she's such a lyrical expert that she's just sort of doing whatever she wants in cases like this. So yeah, very rocky track, this one, as is obligatory in the punk genre. And it also contains some atonal sections, both in the introduction and the chorus. So it's very angular and aggressive sounding. Other interesting musical features include the word painting. I think it's called a word painting in the bridge, filling me up with the shivers and quivers. I actually think it's an unusual example of a double word painting, because she's squeaking either because she's filled up or because she's quivering, i.e. having an orgasm. Let's not be coy about it. Anyway, I think it's brilliantly, cleverly written, this one, and exciting. I love it. Something a bit different, isn't it? As people say. Now, number 3, The Infant Kiss. Now we're going to a full-on ballad, which feels appropriate at this point. Again, good programming. Well done, Kate. Now, once again, this track alternates between major and minor home keys, F sharp major and F sharp minor. Again, sort of evoking, I think, the dualism and the album's fundamental theme, good and bad, the good and bad sides of the drives, essentially. I should also say that I think the chord progression here is very unusual and interesting, as it is on a lot of these songs, but it's particularly interesting here. I think this shows her very rich, as I was sort of mentioning earlier, her very rich musical imagination. She's not using standard chords. I think it's an important element of this music, right? This kind of experimentalism, chordal experimentalism. It's not all about the tunes here. It's also about the beds. The beds are the sort of slightly become the protagonist. Although she does need frequently to weave, as I said earlier, an interesting melody around them in order to make them work. But yeah, again, slightly reminds me of Joni Mitchell, who sort of does the same thing, I think. Starts with the chords, and there's some interesting chords, and then the melody that's woven around them is almost obligatorily interesting, not always, but at least that's what, when it works, that's true. The words here are really screwed up, in a Freudian sense. It's about a governess falling in love with a child because she fantasizes he's actually a man. Now, I don't know if fantasy is the right word here. I mean, it could be a delirium, I wondered if this was sort of like The Man with the Child in His Eyes off the first album, but in reverse. But in any case, I mean, this is a classical theme, really. It sort of enhances the Freudian air of the album. The child's playroom is painted as a sort of sexual primal scene again. And Freud, as people might know, wrote a famous essay on infantile sexuality, which he always said was one of the reasons that psychoanalysis was not widely accepted. People found that difficult to accept in bourgeois society. The children might have a fantasy life and things like that. To be honest, my interpretation of this track is that it's about the Freudian short circuit between childhood sexuality and adult sexuality, right? Which seems logical. The primal trauma and the later trauma. What's weird here is that she's the adult, but she's singing as if she's a child as well, which confuses things even more. I mean, actually, it's supposed to be based on a 60s film, The Innocents, right? Which in turn was based on The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So those are ghost stories. So the implication here is that the child is possessed by a ghost, right? But of course, even in that case, I mean, the ghosts in all of those stories are understood to be kind of sexual in the last instance, as it were. That's to say, part of the sort of bourgeois unconscious, perhaps we could say. Track 4, Night Scented Stock. Not too much to say about this. It's a transitional instrumental fragment sung a cappella. Although it does make reference to an earlier song, Blow Away, which might, I suppose, add to the idea that this is an indirect concept album. And again, great chords, but not much else to say on that one. Okay, side 2, track 5 is Army Dreamers. Now the penultimate number here, Army Dreamers, is one of the big 3 hit singles on the album. Curiously, it doesn't come on like a big hit single. It's very catchy, but it's not a mega production. It's rather balladish, or perhaps we could say ballad adjacent, And it's in waltz time, Can't imagine anyone dancing to a waltz, can you? I mean, I mean that ironically, of course, but like nowadays, I mean, at least. But anyway, yeah, it's a lovely track. Again, catchy, good tune. Powerful anti-war song, perhaps appropriate for these times, or any times, I suppose. She actually samples guns cocking and army officers shouting orders in the track, which is evocative. And the story seems to be about a mother mourning her teenage son who's been sent back by what Kate Bush calls the BFPO, which I think is the British Forces Post Office. I don't know if they're responsible for transporting the bodies, and that's why she keeps singing BFPO in the song. I also sometimes wonder whether she has Ireland in mind here. I mean, we were back in the Troubles then, weren't we? And I think Kate Bush has Irish heritage, if I'm not mistaken. She also seems to be doing an Irish accent here, and she uses sort of, perhaps you could say, Gaelic singing ornaments. But I think that's all a little bit allusive. I don't think she's getting that political. Perhaps you could say this is an indirectly political song. Anyway, it's a brilliant track, but not quite as brilliant as the wonderful final track, Breathing. I believe this was the first track she finished for the album, and she was terribly excited about it and took a while finishing it. And then, it took her ages then to get on with the rest of the album afterwards. It's a bit like a sort of Good Vibrations scenario, I suppose. So yeah, this track 6, Breathing. Perhaps another quasi-political song. It's a story of a nuclear holocaust, right? She described this one as a little symphony, right? It definitely wouldn't leave prog fans wanting for more, I think. It has a sort of mini introduction, and then there's verses and choruses, and then there's a music concrete, atmospheric middle section, and a big ending based around reiterating the chorus. So it's sweet-like, this one. She actually said it was slightly influenced by Pink Floyd, and it does have Wall vibes, I think. It's serious, sad, and minor keys, and vaguely political, and slightly operatic. So yeah, The Wall by Pink Floyd all over, I suppose. Apparently it's sung, to say a little more on the lyrics, it's sung from the point of view of a fetus, which is a clever idea, I think. And the fetus is submitted to the atmospheric pollution that the outsiders are being submitted to, right? So we talked earlier about maternal identification, and here it's stated quite directly, right? The fetus is breathing in the mother's smoke, but the fact that the fetus is going, it means that there's no hope at all, basically. So it's a sort of a double death, really, since we assume that everyone's dying here on the outside and on the inside. I think this is also a women's issue. We were talking about hysteria earlier. People will know that hysteron means womb in Greek, right? I think this is a woman's issue because it's like, it reminds me of the Sophocles, ancient Greek play Antigone by Sophocles, which is about a woman who's buried alive because she buries her brother when she's not supposed to. But then they open up her grave and she's committed suicide because the leader of Thebes, repents in the end. Creon, but then when they go back and open up her grave, she's committed suicide. So she has to sort of die twice in order to die at all, right? So in other words, the death being portrayed here is absolutely final, right? Thus compounding the tragedy. But yeah, what else? Yeah, as I said, the music here is very appropriate, very sad and deathly and very moving. So really, I suppose this is like a perfect, if somewhat downbeat, end to the album. I love this track. And as I say, apparently Kate Bush did too. She's very proud of it, as she should have been. At this point, it might be worth remembering that the album is called Never Forever, a phrase that doesn't emerge in any of the songs, as I said earlier. So perhaps I wondered if that title could ultimately be seen as a reference to the inevitability of the final track, right? In both senses. It wraps up the LP and it predicts a final death for all. In other words, never will be forever, And as I said, in the same moment, it sort of alludes to the death that's desired by Antigone, Again, we're back to the death drive. That's to say, the freedom from all social constraints. And perhaps by extension, the death that's desired by all women, according to the psychoanalytic meta theory, if you like, which of course is what makes women the ultimate ethical hero in the Greek tragedy and in the psychoanalytic universe, really, which seems to have provided most of the material for this album. Anyway, I hope that was somewhat illuminating. Brilliant album. Check it out now. And yeah, I'll see you on the next edition of Crapper, which should be coming up next week. And I hope you all have a lovely week, and we'll speak shortly. Okay, ta-ra everyone. Bye. Thanks. Bye.